So that was a very lovely introduction. But yeah, I'm Jess Gu, and today we're going to talk a little bit about Asian American health disparities and what that means to me. So a little bit about myself, so that you have a lens in which to filter this information from. This is me as a little child. As many people would ask, I am from this country. This is my family, my dad, my mom, my little sister, and this is me and my wife, famous Gasworks. If you've gone biking there, you should. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I identify as Asian American. As a political identity, I identify as Taiwanese American as a cultural identity. I'm queer. I'm a physician, as I said, a family medicine doc. I grew up in the middle class. My parents are graduate, educated, and I identify as a radical. So what do I do most of my time? So most of my time I spend doing sort of clinical medicine, which all of you are training very hard to one day do. My main clinic is at International Community Health Services. So we are an FQHC, Federal Qualified Health Center, community health center. It's basically a safety net clinic. We historically and continue to largely serve Asian American patients. One day a week, I do a really great clinic at Asian Counseling Referral Services. So that's a social work, psych, community center, a little bit. It's right near like Rainier MLK. And I do a primary care clinic there for patients there who have severe mental illness. I do residency teaching at Swedish Medical Center with the Cherry Hill residency, and that includes sort of OB and inpatient mostly. And then I write for sort of this radical news collective called This Can't Be Happening. So we're going to do a little poll everywhere here. You can take out your phones, or if you have an internet device, you can hook up. So basically, you either go to pollev.com/Gooster, or text GUHSTR to 37607 to join, and text in, what are you hoping to get out of this lecture? Hopefully it will be similar to whatever I have in the slides that are coming, but nice to know. Oh my God, I'm getting so old I can barely read them up there. Facts. I will try to provide alternative facts this evening. Does anyone need help with this technology? It's okay, you don't have to be embarrassed. I was just doing a train the trainer presentation with like family medicine faculty, which are all a little bit of a different generation. And we were running late the whole time because we didn't budget in 20 minutes to get everyone connected to the poll. We didn't realize it would take so long for folks to figure it out. Awesome. Okay, well, lucky for me, I'm hoping to cover all of these things. Okay, where do you think Asian American Pacific Islander health disparities come from? I'm a little offended that you think I cause disparities, but I appreciate that. Man, that's all you guys take? 5 slides. I haven't even said anything yet. Yeah. So social determinants of health, that's a really great blanket statement, right? Like everything is because of social determinants of health. Countries of origin. Interesting. Is the person who typed in countries of origin willing to expound upon that? What do they mean by that? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just touch it. I have to hold it.
Whoa, that is so fancy.
So my comment was on how disaggregation is a big issue within the API community and how you might have resources that are allocated for Asians or Pacific Islanders, but within the Asian population, you have Japanese, Korean, Chinese. You also have Hmong, Cambodian, Lao, and Burmese. And that might not always be receiving the same medical treatment depending on what communities you're trying to target.
Okay. Do you want to come up here and give the rest of the lecture? Or That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Okay, so mostly cultural issues, it sounds like language, culture, and then some sort of systemic stuff related to racism. Okay, overall, how well are Asian Americans doing compared to other minority groups in the US? You guys are good multiple choice test takers, right? That's how we all got here. We're very good at multiple choice, right? C. Can C be wrong? It cannot be wrong. Okay, so we have a pretty big quorum, maybe a little bit better, depends on the situation. So this would be the time in most lectures on health disparities where you would just get like a data crunch, right? You get slide after slide after slide that would be like, and this sucks for these people, and this sucks for these people, and this sucks for these people, and look how horrible this is. And we'll have a little bit of that, but I think the biggest thing to keep in mind when it comes to Asian American health disparities is we just actually don't know. So when they got together to do Healthy People 2010, they were like, oh, we actually don't even know what metrics we're trying to hit for Asian American Pacific Islanders because we don't know where we're at right now. And there was a systematic study that was done and said that 0.2%, so not 2%, but 0.2% of federal health-related grants and 0.01% of Medline articles actually mention AAPI at all, right? So that's very, very low. To give you some sort of reference point, Asian Americans are estimated to make up about 6% of our population. If you consider that Asian Americans make up a significant portion of the people who are doing the research, that's also like extra shocking, right? In addition, they also talked about disaggregation, right? So Asian American, so like I didn't wake up one day and was like, I identify as an Asian American, right? That's like an identity that is put upon a group of people from outside because the majority group has decided that you all seem similar enough together to be counted as one group, right? And so like, you know, my parents didn't identify as Asian American. They didn't really identify as Asian until they got to this country, right? Then they were like, oh, I see now, that's my role here. And so like that disaggregation issue is that even if we do study Asian American, it's a very large group of people, right? And so what happens when you take a lot of people and average all of their numbers, you get an average, right? And so even if we do have data on AAPI stuff, because it's such a large group, there's no other sort of grouping that we have in this country that encompasses so many different types of people. The numbers are kind of useless, right? It doesn't really tell you anything. It just tells you the average of like a ton of people. Well, this clicker is very sensitive. Okay, so what do we know? There's a few things. So I think right off the bat, if we start off, which is like standard data, leading causes of death. So by race up here, this is 2014 data from the CDC. By race, you can see Asian Americans already kind of have a different health profile than others. So whites, blacks, heart disease, whereas Asian Americans' number one cause of death is cancer. Same for men as well. So there's a couple of common Asian American things when people say like, oh, well, what are Asian American health issues? When people ask me that, the things that I know that they want me to tell them about are things like Hep B, right? They want me to tell them about things like TB. And so what are the numbers of Hep B? It's impressive. So 1 in 12 people in this country that are Asian American have Hep B. Up to 2/3 of those people don't even know that they're infected. Liver cancer from hepatitis B is the number one cause of death, cancer death among the AAPI, right? And then considering that cancer is the number one cause of death, right? This is a leading cause of death in AAPI, and it's so sad, right? Because it's totally preventable. And AAPI make up 6% of the US, but over 50% of hepatitis B cases. So if you look at the rates of Hep B related deaths, I mean, there's not really much else to say. What are other things we think about? I think this comes back to a lot of sort of like cultural and language barriers. So when you look at a lot of the safety efficacy data, so this one looked at Asian Pacific Islanders, Hispanics are more likely to die from complications in hospital than whites and blacks. Right? I don't think it's surprising that these are the two groups that traditionally don't have English as their primary language. And also culturally probably don't know how to navigate the system. Right? TB. There's a little infographic from the CDC. So yeah, we have case rates 29 times higher than white folks. It's really high. It's pretty high. African Americans 8, Hispanic Latinos 8 times. What's interesting about TB is that we are making improvements. So this is the case rate per 100,000 by race. And you can see all of them, for the most part, are doing pretty well. Asian Americans, not surprisingly, is kind of running out the pack. What's disturbing to me is, so right here, the reason why we don't have any data for Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander is up until this time they had been lumped into the AAPI group, right? So it wasn't until this time in which we decided that, okay, we're going to separate you into another group, which again, I think kind of points to like how arbitrary some of these groupings are, right? But you can see that once you parcel this out, even though Asian Americans in general are doing better in terms of their rates, there's no clear trend line for Native Americans, Pacific Islanders, right? If anything, it's probably going a little bit up in terms of the case rate report, which is contrary to most of the other lines. It's the only other one is multiple race. And then the other question is, so when you see rates coming down, that's great, but then it doesn't really speak to inequity, right? So who is improving? So when we think about inequity, it's always one of those crazy things where you say, oh, we put this intervention in, and it did not improve inequities, even though maybe health outcomes improved, right? Because if, for example, the majority group also improved by 5 points, and then the minority group improved by 5 points, that inequity is actually still the same, right? And so if you look at percentage of TB cases by race, you can see that actually Asian Americans are shooting straight up. So that says to me that we are doing a better job, right? If we were improving rates across the board, then those would be straight lines, right? So we're doing a better job at targeting Black Americans and white Americans in terms of catching their TB and treating their TB, preventing TB. Not the case for Asian Americans and Latinos. Mental health. So that's another one that comes up a lot. And I think, again, this is something about statistics, right? Like we all know that, I mean, even before the Trump administration, statistics were something that are somewhat malleable, right? Like how you interpret them, which ones you choose to represent, right? And so on one hand, mental health is typically one of the things that comes up among AAPI health issues that people cite. On the other hand, there's mixed statistics about it. So for example, let's take a look. My personal bias is that yes, mental health issues are not just a problem in AAPI, but they're at a higher rate than, for example, non-Hispanic whites. So let me show you a little bit about this. So this is what I looked up. So this is the Washington State population by race. So there's 600,000 Asian Pacific Islanders in this state. And in the state of Washington, there's 10,000 Laos, which means that they make up less than 2% of the whole AAPI population in Washington. So I mentioned to you that I work both at ICHS and the Holly Park Clinic, which is like my primary site. And then I have my second clinic at ACRS, the site for Asian Americans with mental health issues, right? And there's a very large difference between the demographics at each of those sites, despite the fact that they're less than a 5-minute drive away from each other. So this is the Holly Park site demographics. And then this is my panel. Now, to be fair, these statistics have the same sorts of problems that most sort of healthcare EHR things have, right? Not everyone's reported, all those sorts of things. But if you look at it, so for Cambodian Khmer, Lao, and Mien, at the Holly Park site, it makes up about 7% of the population. To me, that makes a little bit of sense. Probably more Asians are located in urban areas, right? More of the Laos are probably urban areas. In my panel at ACRS, where I have a lot of the severe mental health, 7 plus 12%. So my rate of Lao patients is 3 times higher in the site that's specifically geared towards folks with mental health issues. And to me, I mean, honestly, as an Asian American that's from East Asia, right, I maybe historically have an understanding of all of the trauma that's gone on in Southeast Asia, but really the most recent and the most horrific, right, I don't think you can really argue that Cambodia had pretty significant trauma during the 1980s, right? The most recent and the most prolific. And so it's not surprising that they have higher rates of mental health issues. What's interesting is that according to the CDC, they report that AAPI people report less mental health concerns than non-Hispanic whites. And so to the CDC, mental health is not an issue for AAPI.
How much do you think the cultural stigma against mental health plays into the numbers that you see there?
Yeah. So certainly for this one, the number of AAPIs that report mental health issues to the CDC, for sure, I agree, and that's probably why it's underreported. In terms of the slide that I just showed you before, that's just seeking primary care services, and so I think one could argue that maybe there's something about ACRS that's more open to allow patients, and that's why they've come there, as opposed to having mental health issues. Again, statistics are however you want to interpret it, but I would also note that at ACRS, when I look at my patient panels, the Vietnamese and Chinese people that I see there typically have schizophrenia, bipolar, things that are generally inherited, right, or more innate, depression, anxiety, whereas the Lao and Mien patients tend to have very significant PTSD and anxiety. I haven't done that study, obviously, but there's definitely a significant difference. So on the other hand, what other studies do we have? So we have that AAPI teenagers, 18.9% of them report considering suicide, whereas only 15.5% of white teenagers report that. Similarly, out of high school students, AAPI high school students report an 11% rate of attempting suicide, whereas their white counterparts only report a 6.2. And these are young people, right? And so when I look at these two statistics, again, I think it just gets to the fact that I don't really know how to interpret all of this, right? And I think, again, a lot of it goes back to Asian Americans being an invisible minority. And so how many people here have heard about how there's a racial disparity between folks who show up to the ED with heart attack symptoms, right? White folks are more, I think one of the studies came out of UW, right? The Green article, they had all this implicit bias stuff, that Black men and Black women, but Black men in particular, the ones that are studied the most, are less likely to be referred or offered cath than white folks, despite the fact that they're more likely to be thought they have MI. So when you rate these patients on how likely you think that they're going to have an MI, all of the doctors say that they think they're more likely than the white patients to have an MI, and yet they're referred to cath less. What we don't hear about is that that's actually true for Asian Americans as well as Latino Americans. And if you can remember back to that TB slide, so African Americans, they do have a higher rate of TB than white Americans, right? What's really interesting is, so I just pulled this off of the website, just on the bar. They sort of says, I'm going to look at TB and I'm going to look in specific population. The first one up there is African American community, despite the fact that their rate is actually lower than Asian Americans. But I don't see anything up there about Asian Americans. All right, the next one. The concept of the model minority is true. You guys gotta wait a minute. This is like a filler slide. There you go. This is the difference for this C, right? Not sure is never the right answer. So not many people are picking it. All right, so mostly disagree, but there's a good contingent who think that it's definitely something that has some truth to it. And some of the statistics would support that, right? So this is age-adjusted death rates by sex race. And you can see Asian American Pacific Islanders have the lowest age-adjusted death rate, even lower than white folks. What's underneath here a little bit is what you can see is persons of Hispanic identity, ethnicity, might be of any race, rates of AI and AAPI populations are underestimates because of inconsistencies between race on death certificates and census and surveys. So what does that mean? So basically when they calculate these rates by looking at the death certificates, right? And the race list on that versus the numbers they have in their census, right? So if those races are not adding up, then for example, if people don't list Asian as consistently over there on their death rates or on their census, then these numbers don't make as much sense. Yeah.
One question I have was, are South Asians even? It's like on the earlier slide, like South Asians are in there. So like I wonder, like, how is this done? Generally speaking, in medicine, are South Asians considered AAPI or not? And if they're not, who's taking, say, South Asians?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and I mean, I think that the fact that you have to ask that question is indicative, right? Like, no one's being like, oh, do Nigerians count as black? I wasn't sure. Like, is there a list somewhere? Right? Like, no one's asking that question. Yeah. The census data is AAPI, right? That includes everyone, right? So South Asians, even technically folks who most people consider sort of more in the Middle East, right? Afghanistan, for example, technically is still Asian American, though many people forget that. In terms of medicine, if you do those studies, yes, South Asian typically will fall under the big umbrella of AAPI, mostly because that they just don't have the numbers to be separating that out. That being said, I think you're right. You're hitting on something that's very important culturally, right? So I say that my clinic serves largely the AAPI community, and it does. The number of South Asians that we serve is much, much smaller. It's minuscule. And the number of South Asian staff that we employ is also very small. One could argue that, at least for other countries like Laos or Thai, those are very small countries, right? It's hard to argue that South Asians don't make up a large population, right? They're pretty big. So I absolutely agree. And that's something that I think not that amongst Asian Americans, and this is what I mean, like this is a term that was put upon us, right? And so somehow we're now lumped all together, even though like we don't necessarily feel like there's much that we have in common, other than now that we all get treated the same because they think we're the same. So here's the aggregated data slide. So this was something that came out of LA County. It's about income, right? And so if you look at it, these are the different groups of Asian Americans. Oops, wow, this is so sensitive. Whoa. Asian Americans, so you can see Hmong at the top, Cambodian, Tongan, Samoan, all the way down. And this is so LA County in aggregate, and this is white non-Hispanic. So you can see the federal poverty line, 18% down here. And all of these Asian subgroups are far above that in terms of percentages. In this country, because of the way that we think about race, it's like white versus black, right? Generally speaking, people are like, well, are you doing as bad as black people? If you're doing as bad as black people, then that's bad, right? If you're doing as good as white people, then that's good, right? So that's typically culturally, whether that's right or wrong, that's how we see it. So here's the data for black folks. This is the federal poverty line, and this is 200% of the federal poverty line. So not only are Asian Americans in some subgroups have poverty rates similar to African Americans, some of them far exceed it. And what about what happens when we aggregate health data? So the tops are rates for stroke at the top. So dark green, non-Hispanic whites, light green, AAPI. Our stroke rate is great, 1.8%. Coronary heart disease, 6.5% versus 2.9%. What if you look at Korean women? Or in another study, they broke it out into Asian American, Asian Indian men and Filipino women. It's remarkable, right? It's hard to argue that these numbers should be anywhere in this grouping, right? And diabetes. So similarly, I think it's really clear that Black Americans, Latino Americans have higher rates of diabetes. Never once in med school going through did anyone tell me that Asian Americans have higher rates of diabetes as well. And what's interesting is like the slide before, I was talking about how aggregated data hides things, right? In this case, it doesn't even. You see here at the end, all aggregated, all AAPI, the diabetes rate is actually higher than white Americans, right? Again, if we look at the comparison of Black Americans, it's the same, but it's never mentioned. And then of course, when you disaggregate it, yes, then it's significantly worse in certain API groups, right? Diabetes is probably like the disease of America, right? It's shocking that this isn't really discussed. So where did the model minority myth come from? One of the major sort of platforms that kind of hurtled it forward was Ronald Reagan. In the 80s, he sort of ran on this platform, and one of the things that he said was he literally said, "Thank you, Asian Americans, for preserving the American dream by living up to the bedrock values of America." And the data that he looked at was median household income. So you can see, he said, oh my God, they have made it, like I said, if you're doing as good as white people, then you're doing pretty good. They're doing better than white people. Look at how much money they're making. But again, it's all about statistics, right? Because what does median household income mean? That means a whole household. So then what if you look at the number of workers per family? Asian American families had more workers. You have more workers, of course you're going to make more money, right? One could argue that having 2.2 versus 1.6 does not equal 53,000 to 47,000, right? And so what is the median personal income difference, right? Because that's really the key. And you can see, regardless of educational status, Asian Americans make less. And then on top of that, think about, where do Asian Americans live, right? We live in urban areas. So if you look at all of the places, these are little green dots are Asian American people, right? All big cities, all really expensive, right? So your income, your average income is not really fair to compare to white folks, right? Who live everywhere, right? A fair comparison would be to compare to white folks in the same zip code, right? Or white folks in the same city. And then there's medicine. And this is arguably why I think that anyone who's interested in racism, which should be everyone, in medicine needs to understand Asian American issues, particularly the model minority myth, because we are the only group of color that is growing, right? So this is a Newsroom article. It looks at the race of medical graduates over the past few years. And you can see Black, African American, Hispanic, Latino, American Indian, Alaskan Native, all of them are completely flat down here. The only person of color group that's growing is Asians. And so to a certain extent, again, you're saying, well, we're doing pretty good then. Remember that these are sort of absolute rates. So not only does that mean one could say, oh, we're not making any progress with these, we're going backwards, right? Because the number of medical students are actually growing, but the number of Black medical students that are graduating is staying the same. So the proportion of them is actually decreasing. But let's look at some of the other statistics. So at NIH, 21.5% of Asian other scientists are API, but only 4.7% of lab or branch directors are API. In Silicon Valley, the other stereotypic area, over 30% of engineers are API, but they only make up 6% of board members and 10% of corporate officers. This is a bit of an old statistic, because that year we didn't have 6% of people yet. 4.8% of the population was Asian American in this country at that time, and only 0.3% of corporate offices. So even though this number is growing, I mean, you can just simply reflect and think on yourself, even though you know probably a lot of Asian American doctors, how many Asian American deans do you know? How many Asian American heads of departments do you know? I don't know that many. And part of this issue is really identifying what happens when you pull out one group of color, right? And so why did Ronald Reagan run on that? Because in the 80s, there was a lot of race tension. And so this idea was that if you can say, oh, look, this group of people of color, they made it, they're doing fine. It is not white people's fault. It is not society's fault that Black folks are not doing well. It's clearly the Black people's fault, right? Because we have these other group of color, they're doing just fine. And then at the same time, we all internalize these messages, right? Like, we're not immune. So when you talk about implicit bias tests, we say 70% of white Americans who take the implicit bias test are biased towards white skin. 50% of Black people who take it are also biased towards white skin, right? We're immune. So it's not like we're immune. Just because I'm Asian doesn't mean that every time I take the implicit bias test, I don't think that Asian is foreign. I still have that association, right? And so what does that mean? It means I internalize this idea that because of my own hard work, my smarts, my ability, I'm doing better than other folks because of me, right? As opposed to this idea that Asian Americans might be doing better because of the way that we shape immigration. And so certain immigrants who come across have privileges when they arrive, educational privileges, financial privileges, things like that. If you break out the Asian American minority into those who arrived as refugees and those who arrived as college graduates, right, you see very different numbers. Right? It has nothing to do with their race, right? That difference has a lot to do with the privileges that they arrived with. So when you have this false perception of parity between Asians and whites, one, discrimination goes unnoticed. Right? Two, as you mentioned, support is not done, right? So in LA County, the poverty rate for Hmong is skyrocketing, right? But I highly doubt there's that many programs specifically geared towards Hmong, right? But I bet there's a lot of programs specifically geared towards African Americans, Latinos, maybe some to AAPI, right? Even if it's to AAPI, it's not necessarily going to the most needy AAPI, right? and again, this internalized identity that can be just as damaging. Perpetuates this myth of meritocracy, right? That I got here because of what I did. And it's a hard thing, right? Because I do work hard, believe me, I work hard. But you can be both, right? You can have both privilege and work hard, right? Just like it's like if I'm racing against someone, I can both run as fast as I can, but also start ahead of them, right? Divisive between members of the Asian diaspora, and it's divisive between people of color, right? And so this is one of those like classic internet memes. By the way, never look for these internet memes. They're so disturbing what people are putting out there. But yeah, so the claims that white America keeps other cultures down overlooks the fact that Asians come to America and are successful. And so this is, no, you guys did this already. So I just want to show back like the survey that we did before, right? So yeah, it depends is really, really complicated, right? Okay, so the Rodney King riots. Are you guys old enough for the Rodney King riots to happen? Yeah, I feel like I was just a kid when it was happening. So what happened? Basically, Rodney King was a man who was alive before the smartphone. And so while Black Lives Matter has done a really great job of sort of trying to harness people power by like anytime a police officer comes up, you put your cell phone up and start videotaping, right? That didn't happen back then. So what happened was Rodney King got pulled over by some white police officers in Los Angeles, and this man just happened to be playing with his newfangled technology called a video camera. And as he was doing it, he basically caught these police officers beating Rodney King. And it incited a ton of race riots because what ended up happening was all of those police officers were acquitted. I don't even think they were indicted. But obviously, people were upset about this. What's interesting is you look for infographics on this. You see some of the typical things, Black people, riots, police. What is this? Was there a Korean cop? What happened? Yeah, you were there. You were alive. Anyone else? No? Yeah.
A lot of the riots impacted Korean store owners and small businesses.
Yeah, so what happened was when it incited not only this racial issue between whites and blacks in LA, but it incited this growing tension between Korean Americans who had moved into sort of historically African American communities. In this tension that really played out this model minority thing, that Korean folks had their own small businesses, they were working hard, they're like making money and making the American way, and they saw these African Americans wandering around, not really understanding how race politics happened in the US, thinking that they're lazy, stealing stuff from my store. And so when the race riots happened, a lot of the damage happened with Korean Americans, right? And I think that this is a really classic example of how we ended up getting pitted. Because really, like, it meant that not only did Korean Americans take the brunt of all the damage, like, white Americans were just, like, off in the corner, like, you know, as if they had nothing to do with any of this, right? So I remember, I'm sure you guys have been to Mama's Pizza, or what's the place name? Yeah. Hot Mama's. I don't know if you guys heard or not. Stranger wrote an article once that was like, just so everyone knows, Hot Mama's actually has really good pizza. You just don't know because every time you eat it, you're wasted. But if you were to eat it sober, it actually is very good. I don't know. I haven't had a chance to test it. But I do remember my very first night as going out as an intern class, right? And we're all standing in line, and these two girls in front of me, we're all friends, we're all there, and we're all excited about pizza, and they're like chatting, and then they're like, Jess, do you like want to split a slice of pizza with the both of us? And I was like, no. I was just trying to decide if I should buy a whole pie or if one would be enough, right? But it really illustrates the issue, right? Like, we are fighting over the small piece of pie when there's a whole pie out there that could be more equally distributed, right? And the model minority issue is a big one. And I think the silence that Asian Americans have around it is incredibly important and sad. So maybe a more recent ones that everyone here has lived through. What is this a picture of? New York, good. Use your microphone.
There was an Asian cop that I don't know, either shot or hurt an African American person.
Yeah, he killed a very young African American girl. and he was charged for it. And in the middle of that trial, he got a whole bunch of what I believe are misguided Asian American folks protesting for him. And I can understand kind of where it comes from, right? It comes from this idea that white folks are doing this all the time and they are not even indicted. An Asian guy gets up here, makes the same mistake, if you want to call it a mistake, whatever happened, does the same thing, and now you're going to accuse him of murder, right? That's clearly racist. Right? But that loses sight of the bigger picture, which is that it's not that everyone should get off equally, it's that they should all be punished equally, right? That when you murder someone, when you shouldn't be, right, that's what murder means, that you should all be equally punished, right? And so, again, this is a really big example, I feel like, of having this very small idea of like this feeling that something's not quite right, but then sort of misattributing or misfunneling your energy. So when we get to all of this, I hope that by this point, what I've sort of illustrated is that race is an incredibly arbitrary thing, right? I think we've all probably heard that race is a social construct. But at the same time, I'm sure you've heard that there are certain medical things that you're supposed to do. I don't know if you've gone through your blood pressure section right now, but within the national guidelines, right, Black people are supposed to get different medications than white folks, first-line treatment for blood pressure. So how do we reconcile both of these things? That medical schools, at one hand, say that race doesn't make any biologic difference, and on the other hand, very well-known, recognized guidelines seemingly saying the opposite. So I think the biggest question for me is always like, well, where did race come from to begin with? And I think what we like to think is that it's just something that we've noticed, right? Like I have different color skin, you have different color skin, and so race has always existed. As long as intercontinental travel existed, race has existed. But race, in the way that we think about race, has not actually. I would argue that previous to that, what existed was different pigments of color. But the idea of race didn't exist until the founding of the U.S. So this is like a little trailer for a series of documentaries that California News World put together that was really fantastic. If you have time to watch them, you should, on race.
All men are created equal. All men are created equal. It's the lofty and revolutionary ideal at America's core. Yet it was written at a time when some inhabitants were held in bondage, and others were being dispossessed of their lands. How did American society justify unequal treatment based on skin color and national origins? How did it reconcile that contradiction? America created a story, the story of race. Race is never just a matter of how you look. It's about how people assign meaning to how you look. We have the idea that it's somewhere written in stone that there are these fundamental differences between human beings. We don't realize that race is an idea that evolves over time, that it has a history, that it is constructed by a society to further certain political and economic goals. Created over 4 centuries, race has become a powerful and enduring narrative. Moments in America's past reveal how this idea took hold and became the lens through which we view our world. Thomas Jefferson, a Virginia slaveholder, penned the revolutionary words proclaiming human equality in the Declaration of Independence. He also wrote a lesser-known, influential document, Notes on the State of Virginia. Written in response to questions from France about the American colonies, the book reads as a kind of sales pitch for America. Notes on the State of Virginia was not about race, but among Jefferson's descriptions of rivers and seaports, mountains and climate, he expressed his views on the inhabitants of the new land, people from America, Europe, and Africa.
I advance it as a suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind.
It is possible to make the argument that Thomas Jefferson is the first person to truly articulate a theory of race in the United States, and in effect, he has to do so. He has said in the Declaration of Independence that we are all created equal. Well, if in fact we're all created equal, and if in fact we're entitled to our liberty, then how can he possibly own 175 slaves and going up to about 225 slaves at the peak of his slaveholding?
In Notes, Jefferson's words appeared to justify slavery at a time when many were admonishing the founding fathers for espousing freedom, while continuing to support a system of human bondage.
The problem that they had to figure out is how can we promote liberty, freedom, democracy on one hand, and a system of slavery and exploitation of peoples who are non-white on the other. And the way you do that is to say, yeah, but there's something different about these people. This whole business of inalienable rights, that's fine, but it only applies to certain people.
The moment when we become a nation is critical for our understanding of both American nationality and race. We accept the notion that all men are created equal, but then perhaps some of those people who are enslaved are not quite men. That is, we'll keep our ideas of American nationality, but we'll write certain people out of the human family.
And I'm going to hammer on this point for a minute because it's going to jump to another conclusion in a second that I think is really, really important. But how important slavery was to the economic success of the U.S., right, at that time. So all of a sudden, what they wrote is like they found what they considered an endless labor supply. People who would be readily identified, and so when they ran away, they couldn't just meld into the population. People who already knew how to grow tobacco, how to grow rice, from their standpoint, an ideal labor source. Because previous to this, there was nothing about white people. Actually, people were identified more as what religion they were, what country they were. And all of a sudden, in this time, there was this shift that people were no longer called Christian or Englishmen, but all of a sudden this diction changes into white. And so Audrey Smedley writes, in order to transform people solely into property, you must minimize those qualities that make them human. Literature of the early 19th century began to portray the Negro as a savage, in even stronger terms than those that had been used for the Irish 2 centuries earlier. This was a major transformation in the thought about who Africans were. Historian George Fredrickson states explicitly that before 1830, open assertions of permanent Black inferiority were exceedingly rare. But by mid-century, the ideology of Negro inferiority dominated both popular and scholarly thought. And so this became this trend that the majority folks, white colonists, would use race to their needs, right? So we've discussed how because they needed a slave labor, basically they needed a strong labor force that was cheap, they created this idea of white and black. And what's really interesting is that when they first came, the Native Americans were actually thought of as white. So Thomas Jefferson actually wrote, their vivacity and activity of mind is equal to ours in the same situation. we shall probably find that they are formed in mind as well as in body on the same module with the Homo sapiens europus. And what changed? What changed was then maybe 20, 30 years later, they wanted the land that Native Americans were on. And now that they wanted the land that Native Americans on, no longer were they people who were white but just more tan because they were in the sun more, which was what it was generally thought of. Now they're people of color. Now they're no longer the same as white people. They're not as good because that can then justify us taking their land away. So this dovetailed into another sort of historical moment, which was sort of the creation of craniometry, right? I think we've all heard of this idea that like this guy was going to go measure skulls, and then white people had bigger skulls and they were smarter. And this was it wasn't just him, right? It was a whole trend of things. People were measuring everything. And if there was a body part that could be measured, it got measured, right? And it was totally like if black people, for whatever reason that they measured, had bigger ones, and big was bad. And if they had smaller ones, then small was bad. You know what I mean? Like whatever they wanted to fit into that category, they happened, right? And at that same time, this treatise was Types of Mankind. And this was the first major sort of formal publication that sort of said, all of the races are different. There's white, there's Asian, there's black, right? And we're separate. And then what would happen is they'd have these World's Fair. And I think when I was younger, I had this idea of a World's Fair. That sounds awesome. It's just a big fair, right? But in reality, what it was is you can see these little pictures down here. The underlying theme for all the World's Fair wasn't like, oh, what is the cutting edge technology? It was, what is the cutting edge technology of white people? And what is the culture that white people are moving forward? And the flip side of that is they would literally put on exhibition, this is Native American culture. And they would have like a little like group of Native Americans with like a teepee and sort of like walking around while other people were watching them. And that's what all these pictures are of. 20 million people went through these World Fairs at that time. Can you imagine 20 million people being subtly or overtly sold on the idea that white folks are superior to people of color, right? And that is just the natural way of the world. And it gets back to this really key thing that sometimes you think about is like, what if we had just been honest? What if Thomas Jefferson and all his friends had just been like, okay, this is hypocritical. We get it. We said that we all want equal rights, but actually we just want our friends to have equal rights. And those people are probably people too, but we're still going to be mean to them, right? If they had just owned up to that, once slavery was broken down, there wouldn't have been left this insidious idea that people of color are inferior to white folks, right? So the long-lasting issue is not so much that, I mean, obviously slavery is horrible and I'm glad it's gone, but the deeper seated thing that you can't undo, that placed in society is this idea that people of color are inferior, right? So even after we've paved over this, we've fixed slavery, it's gone now, right? What happens when you put a road over quicksand? The foundation isn't there, right? It collapses. And so instead, now we have this even more hypocritical space where we say that people are all equal, but we don't truly believe that in our hearts. Okay, so we're about halfway through. Want to get up, stretch, reflect upon that, decide whether you want to take that poster of Thomas Jefferson off your wall. So, what's the next part? So let's take a look. This time I want to sort of change gears a little bit. And so if we have this idea that I hope by now I've sort of proven to you that race is a societal construct, right? And at the same time, we talk about it all the time in healthcare, right? So what does that mean? But let's delve in a little bit more to understand what we mean by when we say inequity. So for our general graph, right, we have general. It's like I'm an old person. I can't use this technology. All right. We have general healthcare quality here, right? And then this idea that non-minority groups have good health, minority groups have a difference in that health, right? And I use the word difference intentionally because difference doesn't imply good or bad, right? Should be there, should not be there. It just is. And then you think about, okay, so what is causing that difference, right? So some folks say, well, there must be a certain part that's physiologic, I think, right? Or maybe it's patient preference. There's some data that shows patients of color tend to decline intervention more often than white folks do. So that's no one's fault, right? That's just the way things are, and that's okay. But then there's that whole other body that we call inequity, right? And the issue about inequity, and the most important thing to remember, is that like inequity doesn't have to be that way, right? It's preventable. And the big debate that folks have is how much of that difference is physiologic and how much of that difference is inequity. And I'm not going to be surprised, my argument is that almost all of it is inequity. But what does that inequity mean? So we break it down on different levels, right? So you have systems level of inequity. What does that mean? That things like poor access to education or poor quality education. Where do you live versus what clinics are near you and how far away you are from there. Folks, we know that having fragmented care, meaning like if I have my PCP at Virginia Mason and my heart specialist at UW, and then I did my obstetrics at Swedish and none of them talk to each other, that your health outcomes just aren't as good. It's more complicated, right? Pollution, depending on what neighborhood you live in, what you're exposed to. We have the organizational level, racial policies, things that even seem benign that are not particularly racist. So for example, not accepting Medicaid, right? You make a financial decision that Medicaid isn't possible for you to keep your doors open. But at the same time, we know that Medicaid is insurance that disproportionately covers people of color. So by making that decision, you're deciding to preferentially treat white folks, right? Inconsistent enforcement, right? Policies that you sometimes enforce for some people and then don't for others. Language access. The personal level of sort of either straight up bigotry, which is generally frowned upon now, but still flares up, right? Communication issues, mistrust. So, like maybe the reason why people are turning down interventions is because they know that in the past and currently still kind of the healthcare institute is not on their side, right? Or maybe when you thought you communicated to them why you needed this, you really didn't. And then implicit bias, right? This sort of racism of the modern age where we sort of get to where we all have these unconscious biases that we don't even realize that we have that impact subtly the decisions that we make. So these things, most of the time, I think your healthcare curriculum is going to cover pretty well significant. Doctors love covering social determinants of health. So I think your curriculum will cover it. Do you know why? Do you know why they love talking about it? Because it's not their fault, right? I'm a doctor. I have nothing to do with the education system. It's not my fault that those patients don't have good education. It's horrible. It's horrible. And when I go vote in November, I'm definitely going to say that's bad, right? But on a day-to-day basis, I'm not responsible for that, right? All these other levels are much closer to home, right? It's much easier. Have you ever noticed? It's much easier for us to talk about how racism impacts our patients than it is to talk about how racism might be playing out in our own departments, right? Or our own medical school classes. So I want to spend a moment to talk about physiologic and patient preference, because I think this is the area, again, that people really like to lean on, because this is not anyone's fault, right? This is just the way that the world is. And we really overblow how much of an impact this has. And not only is it a detriment for us to overestimate what that is, it continues to reinforce racist ideas that have more damage than benefit. So what do I mean by this? We all know that Black folks have higher rates of hypertension, Not only do they have higher rates of hypertension, once they get hypertension, it tends to be more malignant and they get more organ damage on it. So, how much do genes contribute to higher BP in Black Americans? I actually have no idea how many of you have responded because I forgot to put a little counter here thing. So I'm just gonna guess. About now, everyone's responded. Okay, so most people think less than 10%. How much does racism contribute to higher BP in Black Americans? Okay, a little bit more of a spread. How much does patient decision making contribute to higher BP in Black Americans? So based on the results, it seems like most people think like just above, a little bit above 60%. So somewhere between 40 and 60% is racism. And then the rest of that is maybe patient decision making. Then a small amount, if not zero, is due to genes. I don't know the answer to these questions. Obviously, if I knew, then, well, I probably wouldn't be that famous. Okay. So this is what I was sort of talking about, right? For those of you who are not far enough in your clinical studies yet to have learned about this. So JNC 8, this is sort of like the guidelines that everyone follows. Like if you don't follow these guidelines, you better have a really good justification for them, right? Because it'd be like kind of like malpractice, right? This is what everyone agrees is the right thing. So they come up with these guidelines in terms of what you think. For example, the classic argument over what is your targeted blood pressure goal, right? These are the people who like look through every single article and then decide based on all the evidence, this is what we're going to do. One of the recommendations that still remains is that for non-Black patients, the initial first-line medication includes either an ACE or an ARB. For African American patients, that is not one of the first-line treatments. Does anyone know where that comes from? How did that make it into the clinical guidelines? Yeah.
Was there a study trying to sell the drug, and then when they took away from the whole population to just Black patients, then it passed?
I don't know if that was the history behind it. The major study that they cite is the Hall Hat trial. So they cited one study. Okay, it was a relatively large study, but just one study, right? I don't know any other clinical guidelines that have made it simply from one study, right? And in that study, they basically there's been lots of little studies too that kind of look at, African Americans we think don't respond as well to ACEs and ARBs than white folks. There's a couple key things to know about those studies. So the studies that do happen, even if you believe them, show that for whatever reason, African Americans in those studies don't get the same initial benefit from an ACE or an ARB as a frontline. So maybe white folks on average got like a 7-point reduction, whereas Black folks only got a 4% reduction. But what's important to know is that the actual overlapping, there's more overlap over those than actual difference. And so, for example, the way I might think about it is that on average, men are taller than women, for sure. But there's much more variation between men, and there's much more variation between women. So if I know that someone's a man or woman, I still really don't have any idea how tall they are, right? And a woman could very well be taller than a man. On top of that, the ALHA trial and most of these trials, how do they define race? It's self-identified patient identification. And so they say to all the folks coming in, they say, do you identify as Black? Do you identify as whatever, blah, blah, blah. And they said, okay, everyone who identifies as Black goes in the Black arm. And then everyone else goes into the white arm. So the white arm wasn't just white folks. It was Asian Americans. It was Native Americans. It was everyone else who wasn't Black went into that arm, which doesn't make, so even if you agree that maybe there's a physiological thing between races, that doesn't make any sense, right? And then how do you, when you tell someone that they self-identify as a race, like that's a social construct, right? So I know people who are sort of medium skinned but identify as mixed race. right? I know people who are lighter than that who identify as Black, because most of that time, that identity comes from who you're around and how those around you have treated you and how you see yourself in the world, right? So then so then what do you say? If you have a patient who identifies as half Black and half white, then you're just going to give them like a combination pill? Like, what does that mean, right? When you start really thinking about like the details of this, it doesn't make any sense, right? Everything starts breaking down. And so how did it make it into the guidelines? It made it into the guidelines because of attribution bias, right? We already think that Black people are different than white folks to a certain extent. And so when we see a study that confirms that, we're like, oh yeah, that makes sense, right? It's like when there's like informed consent issues, if they say that they want to do the invention that you want them to do, no one's like, oh no, they're not competent, right? But when the patient's like, no, I don't want to do what you want me to do, then we're like, they might not be competent, right? We need to make sure that they're competent to make that decision. And the danger of this is that the benefit of this guideline is really small, right? If we're talking about the difference between 3 or 4 systolic blood pressure points over an initial first-line drug, like how many people are only on one blood pressure medication? Like not that many. So the actual benefit of this guideline is pretty small. But what is the damage that this guideline does, right? That it continues to reinforce that Black people are different than everyone else and that there's something innate that makes them different. Yeah.
I was also going to mention that the physiology of race really doesn't make sense when you consider that race is a socially defined term. So like I'm half white and half Chinese, but I'm not, I don't look white, so I don't say I'm white, I say I'm Chinese. And I think it's the same with a lot of other people of color. So if you're a quarter Black, then you might present as Black, yeah, but you have more other genes.
Absolutely. And that's the key, right? So it means that like randomly, in a non-scientific way, people were getting distributed into random groups, right? That in itself doesn't really make sense. So this guy's Dr. Oz. This lady's Oprah. I don't know if you've seen them or heard of them. But there was this thing that happened where Dr. Oz was on her show, and they talked about how African Americans have a higher rate of high blood pressure. And does anyone know the controversy that unfolded after this? You guys obviously are not watching enough daytime television. Dr. Oz asked Oprah, why is it that Black people have higher rates of high blood pressure? And she said, oh, I know the answer to this. It is because when the slaves came over from Africa to the States, there was incredibly high selective pressure, right, for people who could hold on to salt. Because when you held on to salt, then you would stay hydrated, right? And so the founding effect of that is that all African Americans in this country, or the vast majority of them, are very sensitive to holding onto salt, and therefore they have high blood pressure, right? I was taught this as a resident, right? A preceptor turned to me and said that this was the case. This has never been, like, first of all, it's not only never been proven, it's been debunked. And yet it's so tenacious, right? Because of this attribution bias issue, right? That it makes sense to us, kind of, right? And we kind of like this idea. It's the same guy, the same thing happened for this guy who, the newscaster who said the reason why Black people are good at basketball is because of slavery, right? Doesn't make any sense either, right? But it makes sense on sort of this gut level, right? Because we know that the data shows that there's actually more difference within a race than there is between races, right? And this guy's pretty smart. He has a MacArthur. He's a population geneticist. And he says, there simply hasn't been enough time since we spread across the globe for extensive differences to have accumulated across the genome. So he's a smart guy. He's telling you that doesn't happen. But what is the data, okay? Because that's what every doctor wants to know, right? So this is just one slide. There's a lot of slides that you can look at, but let's just take this one quick one on hypertension prevalence, okay? So looking at countries that are more, quote, pure than America in terms of their race, right? So you look at these. This is rates of hypertension. These are all the classically European origins, right? And you can see that the rates of hypertension are really variable. US and Canadian whites, all the way up to German whites who apparently are real stressed out. So then that doesn't make any sense, right? But then even if you look it up here, so to say, hey, okay, well in Nigeria, what we've noticed in Africa, there's actually a lot of health outcomes in African populations, or even just in Asia, like the pre-immigrant health outcomes are better than after they get to the States. You say, well, look, this would seem to improve it, right? Nigerians have a lower rate of high blood pressure, and then we selected for all of them who do have high blood pressure to come to. Is it really possible that there was a diversion between Jamaica and the US in terms of which slaves arrived and what genetics arrived there, right? If this theory were to hold, it would seem like Jamaica should be at least up here as well, right? And then you look at several, you can look at other statistics that show that like, oh, health outcomes change very quickly within 2 generations, say, of arriving to this country, right? The genetics component just doesn't play out. If you want to talk about one single allele, fine. Sickle cell, for example. That's an allele, right? But then call it that, right? Because what happens is if you call it race, when really it's racism, it just continues to enforce that cycle, right? And this gets back to your point, exactly, right? Which is that if every single study that we do takes in race as a social construct, and then we apply science to it, somehow we get this like magical thing that since we applied science to it, then the answer will be science. But we started with social garbage to begin with. Doesn't matter what you do to it, it's still social garbage when it comes out, right? There's this interesting study when you look at all these folks who are trying to like see, like they look at the genome and they break it down and they try to say, well, people from Europe have these markers or whatever. And it was really, what's interesting, if you look at all that data, it's really arbitrary, right? You could break it into 37 different groups. You could break it into 6 different groups, right? They chose 6, I think, because that's what makes sense in our world, right? The different continents. But what's funny is when you ran through that data and said, is there any correlation to anything? There actually was a correlation that there was a difference in genetics between those who are Sagittarius and not. But how do we interpret that data? We're like, oh, well, that's just like a random mistake, right? Because if we use a 95% confidence interval, 5% of the time, even if there's no correlation, we're going to pop positive, right? But when it came to race, and we're like, we've proven it, we knew this already. So like we came in with an assumption, we took all of our data off that assumption, did some math to it, and then came out with the same assumption on the other side, and we're like, proved it, right? It doesn't make any sense. I think, what if you put it this way? So many medical conditions are differentially distributed to African Americans: heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, low birth weight babies. Are we to believe that Black people were so evolutionarily unlucky that they got all the genes that predispose them to every malady? Right? Something sort of related to this, and coming back to the Asian part of this, is talking about stereotypes, right? So if we think race is so inherent, then how is it that stereotypes change over time, right? So Asians used to be actually quite feared, right? Yellow peril. No, Fu Manchu. God damn it. How do we go from that to being the mono minority, right? Well, I think we've talked about it historically, right? But in those few generations, did Asians really change so much that we went from really scary people with big heads and big mustaches to really smart children who good at math, right? That can't be the genes, right? And so I want to take a moment to talk about stereotyping because it comes back to the same idea of like, what are our inherent ideas about things? So like, and are stereotypes bad if they're good, right? So Black people are good at dancing. Asians are hardworking. Is that really so bad that Asian people are seen as hard workers? Good that you didn't touch your microphone at that time. Why is this a problem? Because of what it implies otherwise, right? So ones that we're more used to thinking about, women are emotionally smart. That's technically a compliment. Men are good at science. That also is a compliment, right? That's a stereotype. What's so bad about that, right? It's the flip side of that, right? So saying that Black people are good at dancing implies that they're not really good at anything else, right? Asians are hardworking. How does that stereotype fit into this idea that like, oh, have you ever heard that like, yeah, that Asian, like, they're really good at like crunching the number, but they're not really leadership material, right? Because they're just hard workers. Or they're really technically good pianists, but they just lack that emotional component, right? It's easier when we see the ones that we're used to, right? Women are emotionally smart implies that they're not smart in any other way, right? Or that men are good at science implies that women are not good at science. And even bigger than that, when we think about stereotypes, we know that stereotyping is bad, right? If you had a multiple choice test and it was like stereotyping and it said A good, B bad, you would be like, bad, right? But we still believe that there's something about stereotypes that have some inherent truth, right? We kind of have this idea that's like, oh yeah, it's wrong to say all Asian Americans are good at math, but kind of it does seem like there's a lot of really good mathematicians that are Asian. Right? So we kind of have this idea that like we're not allowed to say every Asian person is like that, but we do believe there's that trend. But the issue is that where does that trend come from and what do we attribute it to? So instinctively we attribute it to inherent qualities, right? And that creates a stereotype. We say, oh, maybe, not every Asian is good at math, but a lot of them are. And so that creates a stereotype. In reality, what is another story that could be told? So race is a social construct, right? And so if there's a social construct that is impacting everyone who looks the same way, right? Whether that's policies, discrimination, or armed conflict in a country that causes a whole country to have to leave, right? People respond in the same way, right? And that creates a trend in behavior. Then that becomes sort of the stereotype where we have like, okay, so a lot of Asian people arrived. They now all have laundry stores for whatever reason that was maybe from an external pressure. But then we start to attribute that to just something Asian Americans are good at, right? So what does that look like in reality? So, for example, it's not that Black people are necessarily better at sports, is it? Or could it just be that young Black men, the only image that they have of being successful is through professional sports? Or even worse, the only way that society allows them to be successful is through professional sports, right? Previous to the integration of leagues, basketball was dominated by white people, right? It has nothing to do with inherent ability, but what's available to you. Similarly, when Asian Americans arrived, there was this huge labor backlash against them. And they said you couldn't work in the cigar factories or the jute or woolen mills anymore. All the Chinese had been driven out. All they could do was laundrymen or vegetable peddlers. So when you have these stereotypes of Abu, the convenience store man, and we're like, yeah, there are a lot of sort of dry cleaning people that are run by Asian people. It's not necessarily because we're good at laundry, right? That we're all responding to the same pressure. And along those lines, this idea that Asian Americans are overachievers, right? What if it were the other way? What if it were because there's so much discrimination against Asian people that in order to achieve the same thing, we had to go to an extra few years of school, right? And it's such an important difference, right? Whether or not you inherently are just going to be a good person or you're responding to racism. And that's why semantics is so important, right? And so if you believe that there is something to the ARB ACE data in Black Americans, then the research shouldn't be out there trying to prove that there's a difference. The research should be out there being like, maybe there's an allele there that runs more in these populations, mostly because of racism, because we don't intermingle all that much, right? And so the allele stays in certain populations. It's so much more important to frame it that way, right? Because when you just frame it, for example, I was having a conversation with, where'd you go? Oh, there you go, a gentleman during the break. When we say like, oh, being Black is a risk factor for gestational diabetes, is being Black a risk factor or is racism a risk factor, right? And so along those lines, I already talked about Hep B being an issue for Asian Americans, right? This is the world picture of hepatitis B prevalence. It's not really an Asian thing, right? Really what it is, it's a thing for people who were born in areas that are endemic, right? But we use these shortcuts. And the problem is when you use those shortcuts that are already associated with racism, people automatically make that link. And so one of my favorite quotes at one of the ARB studies was that during the day, Black people in that study did not respond well to the ARB. But then at night, when they were in their own homes, they had an equal response as the white people in that study. And the study person wrote, "It is difficult to explain this finding." And I was like, right? I think we're all on the same page here, right? There's something else going on. And so it's complicated because one could say like, oh, well, maybe because of the social stress from racism, then a beta blocker might work better on Black people because that deals with the stress response as opposed to an ACE inhibitor that deals with the angiotensin system, right? So one could say that there's a social construct that causes one medication to work better than the other. In this particular case, that's not the way that it works out, but it's still a very important distinction to discuss, right, if you're going to say that. Because, like I said, the danger outweighs the benefit. And so the last thing that I would leave you for is no one can read every study, okay? Your professors might tell you that you should, but you just can't. You have to decide what studies to choose that you're going to read and critique, right? And so I will tell you that anything that comes across my desk that is practice changing, that has to do about race, you better believe I'm reading it. Because the chances of that study being flawed is probably much higher than any other study that's going to cross my desk that supports a guideline, right? So that's one thing that I do in my practice when I think about like these sorts of things. So to me, how does this all come together? I just like talked about a bunch of random stuff, but in my mind, it all comes together to a certain extent. So to me, anti-racism is public health, right? We talk about like smoking, we talk about seatbelts, all those things, public health. Racism is a public health issue because they're all intertwined. I think, as we've discussed, they all impact each other. Because what is public health, right? Public health promotes and protects the health of people in the communities where they live, learn, work, and play. And there's nothing, when you think about social determinants of health, education, housing, transportation, there's nothing on that list of things that isn't impacted by race. Right? From 1991 to 2000, there was a study that was done by Health and Human Services. They estimated that 880,000 excess deaths could have been averted had Black Americans' health matched those of whites. For a little bit of comparison, 33,000 deaths due to MVAs in 2010. So multiply that by 10, that's still half the number of people that died due to that health inequity between Blacks and whites, right? But like, I see signs all the time about buckle up and drive, right? I see signs all the time about not driving drunk. We see MVAs as a public health issue. We don't see racism as one. And if we do, that's a controversial one. The other way to think about it. So we know that minorities are undertreated for heart attacks. So this is an implicit bias study, okay? So they normalized for education, they normalized for access, they normalized for payer, all those sorts of things. This was purely, once all those things are normalized, between the physician and the patient. One study estimated that there was an 18% increase in the 5-year mortality rate in African Americans, just in the slice of not recommended to go to catheterization. If you realize that about 20 million African Americans have coronary artery disease in this country, that's a lot of people, right? Okay, so I want to do a quick exercise. Everyone who's heard of the Black Lives Matter movement, raise your hand. Keep your hands up, keep your hands up. Okay, put your hands down if you, keep your hands up if you've like participated in the movement through like an email petition or like you like something on Facebook, something that took you like 5 clicks to support. Okay, so a lot of you. Keep your hand up if you have gone to a protest for it. Okay, so still a fair number of you. 200 to 500, you can put your hands down now. 200 to 500 Black people are killed by a white police officer every year is what the FBI estimates, right? So the number of people that the healthcare institute, like as an institute, we kill every year far exceeds the I would say the flagship issue of the Black Lives Matter movement, right? But I don't see protests outside our hospitals. I don't see petitions. So what does it mean to be an expert in Asian American health? So some people would say it's about content, right? I can tell you that I know how to manage hepatitis B better than probably any of my counterparts in residency. Mostly because I have a lot of hepatitis B in my clinic and I have a lot of people who can't get to specialists, right? Every year when I do my PPD again, I shove a ton of steroid cream on top of it because I think it's turned positive because of the number of people I've seen with TB, right? So maybe that makes me an Asian American health specialist. Or maybe what makes me an Asian American health specialist is that I treat diabetes in Asian Americans because that's an issue. Or that I have a very, very deep understanding and empathetic feeling to what it must mean to go through trauma. So this is a picture from the Cambodian killing fields. These are all dead people. In trauma, when we talk about trauma, it goes through generations. So I have a patient who is Khmer. She's 27. She was born here. She never went through this. But because what ended up happening was her grandmother lived through this, had really bad PTSD, one day had a really bad episode, shot everyone in their family, and her mother survived as a 9-year-old by jumping out the second-story window and hopping onto a boat to Hong Kong. And then she ended up in this country. you can't tell me that trauma hasn't impacted her, right? I mean, she's in my ACRS clinic, right? She has really bad anxiety. She has PTSD of her own. She's been in horrible sort of social and relationship issues. And all of it, I believe, comes back a lot to this, right? So does that make me an Asian American health specialist? I can tell you that I probably know more about Lao, Cambodian, Vietnamese history than most people who are not from those countries, right? Or am I an Asian American health specialist because I understand Asian American cultures a little bit better? Because I can speak Chinese? You will be taught, and you all know, that social determinants of health impact our patients more than anything. And so to me, the way that I really address AAPI health, besides obviously taking care of patients in the most compassionate way I can in my clinic, is through the Black Lives Matter movement. So why is that? It seems a little bit odd, right? Because there really hasn't been much movement in the AAPI community about it. Affirmative action, when you ask folks, who has benefited the most from affirmative action? The studies actually show white women, right? There haven't been that many like explicit pushes for white women. But collectively, when we talk about increasing diversity, and between all of those sort of initiatives that we place, when you look at the statistics, white women, since the sort of invention of affirmative action, have gained the most. And so the idea is that when you have like all these different layers of inequity, intersectionality, if you lift from the bottom, right, everything from above them will also improve. So these arguments they have sometimes that, you know, like the feminist movement is very white women heavy. And there's this argument that people say, well, what about, you know, like women of color, they have their own issues. And then frequently they will hear things like, yes, that's totally an issue. But like, if we focus on this issue, you know, like 80% of the people that we're discussing who are white will benefit, right? Versus like the 3% of Asian American women or whatever. That's a faulty argument, right? Because if you were specifically to aim for the most disenfranchised, I guarantee you that the somewhat disenfranchised folks would also move up with that, right? So when I think about this country, the two groups that are most disenfranchised systematically, right? Native Americans and African Americans, right? And I want to make this clear. It's like magical things are happening back there. I don't even know what's up there. I want to make this clear, right? And this is on a systematic issue, right? It's not to say that Asian Americans don't face discrimination, right? It's not to say that an Asian American has never been lynched, right? What is to say is that on a systems level, Blacks and Native Americans have been exploited the most, right? And so the point is that it's not about, you know, that question is kind of like a false question that I set you up for. Like, how are Asian Americans doing compared to other minorities, right? That's not the question we should be asking, right? The point is that we should be moving together. Because even if I only explicitly focus on, say, quote, Black American issues, what we're talking about is racism, right? I have no doubt that my energies towards justice for the most disenfranchised are going to impact all of those above it. For those of you specifically interested in Asian American stuff, which is why you came, here's a couple of my favorite books. Yellow is a really fantastic book. It's by one of the first Asian American lawyer at Howard University. He talks a lot about sort of politics of Asian Americans. Strangers from a Different Shore, Ronald Takakis from Berkeley, is like sort of a not that thick, but pretty thorough sort of like history of Asian Americans in this country. And I would say that like until you understand your context and your history, you cannot understand your own self and where you're going and why you are where you're at. So that's super important. And then this is just a really good book about sort of like growing up Asian American. Wing Luke Museum is actually one of the most famous Asian American museums in the country, and it's right in our backyard. So you should check it out. The International District in our city actually has a really, really rich story to tell. And so, yeah. But we don't have time for that. But anyway, so 10 minutes. If folks have questions, my email, you can always email me.
What is your advice on how we talk about anti-Blackness within Asian communities?
Good question. So I think that the heart of it is that Asian Americans are subject to the same prejudices that the rest of us are. And that's where that comes from, right? And this sort of gets back to this idea of the model minority, right? That like not only have we internalized racism against blacks in this country, we've also internalized this idea that we are superior. So, I mean, I think it's the same way that we address racism anywhere, but we do it intentionally within our spheres of circle. So I remember when Trump was elected, there was this thing that like a lot of liberal white folks in Seattle were like, well, those are not my white people, you know? And I was like, well, whose white people are they then, right? They're not my white people. And that the way that change is made is through our spheres of influence, right? Because at any moment, you can't tell that like speaking up to grandma, whose race isn't going to die soon anyway, so what's the point? But when you speak up to grandma at the Thanksgiving dinner table, the whole family is there, right? And who knows what cousin Joe heard. And I think similarly, Asian Americans were pretty quiet. And I'll be honest with you, like I'm at SHS when the police brutality initiative came through this past year. I was collecting signatures for it. It was really hard. It was really hard for me to like sort of build up the courage to sort of continue to talk to all of my colleagues about it, because I knew that some of them were going to disagree with me. I knew that it felt really crushing that like I had to take on all of the racism in the Asian American community. But like those white folks, like those are my people, right? And as a person of privilege, like that is my job. And I do think that having those one-on-one conversations can make a big difference. Or just being vocal about it, like posting something on Facebook, whatever your personality is, but I think being more intentional about your sphere of influence is really important.
Share your thoughts on formulate this or suggestions on how to go about bringing the subject to light within our own institution in terms of the kind of the silence that there is in terms of these.
Yeah. So I will say the short answer, there's a few components to that, but the short answer is, generally speaking, implicit bias, I think, is the easiest in. And the reason why implicit bias is the easiest in is that, like I said, there's no excuse that the cause of it is outside your clinic walls, right? Regardless of who you are, if you're training to be a doctor, you're going to interact with patients, right? And so your implicit bias is negatively impacting patients. And secondly, it's that bridge because it's easier to talk about racism that's impacting your patients than each other, right? The beautiful thing about implicit bias is in order to really address it, it forces you to look internally, right? And so it has this like dual reach where it has this easy in because everyone in medicine agrees that patients are important. You have this ethical code that everyone has bought into. But by virtue of examining that, you have to look inside. And so to me, I have found the most success with that. And then I think the second part of that strategy is knowing what's going to happen, right? So white fragility is a thing, right? I mean, it's one of those things like you're saying, like if a disease killed as many people as racism did, we would have lectures about it, right? We wouldn't be all huddled here after hours getting some free pizza, right? It would be part of the curriculum. But what are the things that prevent it from that? And I think a lot of it has to do with this idea of privilege as a really threatening idea, particularly in some ways. NPR did this like little study on race, conversation about race in Seattle, and I think their tagline was like, interestingly, talking to KKK members is easier. Talking to KKK members about race is easier than talking to white people in Seattle about race. Because at least KKK members have a very strong connection. They're consistent between their internal and external thoughts, right? It's very difficult for liberal white folks or liberal Asian folks or whoever to anyone who identifies as not racist explicitly to have to reconcile the idea that they do have implicit bias and racism there. And so having strategizing for how you're going to handle that when that comes up.
So when you looked earlier, there was like very little research, obviously, about AAPI health. And when you go to like the Office of Minority Health obviously, like you said, like the averages show that AAPI are doing better. So how do you like interact to try to get either like push for more research when there's like nothing either there even to begin with to start to show the problem, or when the averages are against trying to investigate that like there actually is a problem because it's hidden by this average.
Right. Yeah, so you might be asking the wrong person for that in the sense that I am not an academic, and that's been an intentional decision, right? I don't really like research. My sphere of influence in terms of not just who I know but my skills tend to be more sort of like this. In terms of research, what I would say a really important thing to recognize is that you have to be careful about what you're studying, right? So I think a gentleman came up to me and sort of talked about earlier how a few years ago they changed the BMI risk category for Asian Americans. I can't remember what it was. I think it was like went from like 25 down to like 23 or something like that. My friends were joking that this happened. This came out when I was in med school, and so we all came into the lecture hall. And my friend was like, before this lecture, my BMI was normal, and now after this lecture, I'm overweight. So on one hand, it's promising that there are things like that are happening, right? We're being studied, but I think that it's also a double-edged sword because what does that reinforce? That particular study reinforces that there's something physiologically different about Asian Americans that cause them to have higher risk at lower BMI. Is it really just because apples have higher risk? In which case, shouldn't we just call it that, right? I think that until we have significant disaggregation, you will never get funding for Asian American research. Because until you have disaggregation, the data will always look like Asian Americans are doing better. And no one wants to research that. Or no one will give you money to research that. And reasonably so, right? The problem with disaggregation is that we're such a diverse group that the numbers are really small. And so I don't think I'm giving you any answers, but letting you know sort of the barriers that are there. And so that's why for me, I sort of focus on this idea of like, does it really matter? It matters to the extent that it needs recognition. And it matters to the extent in which we need to break down the model minority myth, right? But do I really need to know if Hmong folks have a higher rate of diabetes? Or will it be better for everyone if we just really work on implicit bias? So that's my bent, right, as a community doc who doesn't do research. But I think that to that extent, I would say that the social research is more important than the actual like nitty-gritty medical research.
Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. Could you talk about your own kind of journey in developing your voice and also mention some things that somebody like me as a first-year med student who hopes to have a long career in activism should be doing to develop my skills at this point?
That's like the classic medical student question, right? Like, what is the path that is set out for me to succeed? I will check them off. So I will say that as my identity is that I come from like classically the privileged group of Asian Americans, right? So my patients, I mean, to a certain extent, my parents came over super poor, but they did come with college educations, right? And were relatively fair-skinned Asian Americans, and they worked really hard at losing their accents. I grew up in a relatively middle class, and so I think that I am actually the epitome of sort of the scourge of Asian Americans, which is that we have fooled ourselves. People like me have fooled ourselves into thinking that we are pretty much the same as white people, right? I suspect that we are the people who are out protesting Peter Lang, right? What Peter Lang. And so some of that just has to do with a personal decision to reflect on your own privilege, right? Which all of us have now, regardless of what race you are, right? We're doctors sitting, or soon to be doctors sitting in this room. And really knowing your history. And so being radicalized, right? Like, it's not surprising given my identities that I was radicalized around class and queer issues before I was radicalized around race, right? Because race as a privileged Asian American is not as big of a deal. Right? It's the same for white folks, right? When you ask white folks about race, the first thing they bring up is class, right? Because that's what they've experienced. So that was my path, I guess. To be more explicit than that, I was a union organizer after college, And that obviously exposed me to a lot of dynamics about race, particularly of sort of the working class Asian Americans that I didn't have contact with, right? When we talk about Asian Americans, like, I am not the like working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in a Chinatown restaurant Asian American. And my own privilege has blinded me to the experiences of my brothers and sisters who had that. So that obviously was sort of like part of my learning, part of my journey through that, which is, as you can imagine, sort of led me to where I am now. In terms of activism, me personally, spending some time to reflect on, when I say spheres of influence, I don't mean just who do you know and who can you convince, right? I think that's the first thing we think of, right? But the other thing that I think of is, how are you an influencer? So my wife, she is this white girl from Texas. She wears pearls. She passes, right? And she's, not surprisingly, she's been socialized as a white woman to get along with everyone, to sort of bridge. She's a bridger, right? I am not one of those people, right? Like I've learned to sort of be better at sort of being bridging and softer, right? But I'm more of a protest person, right? And both of those skills are okay, and both of them are really important. But being intentional and reflective about like, oh, what is it that I'm good at? What is it that makes me inspired? And like after this talk tonight, I'm gonna go home, I'm gonna feel really good, right? But other times when I've had to like sort of bite the bullet and negotiate with like Swedish folks and be like, oh, I'm gonna have to just like suck it up and be like, I don't go home. And I might have accomplished a lot during that time. Like there was a meeting there to talk about whether or not we should be allowed to wear Black Lives Matter pins in the hospital. And I think that was a really big win, but I didn't go home feeling good because I was playing a role that I don't naturally play very well, that doesn't make me happy, which is sort of like a pleaser and a compromiser and things like that. And so I think being self-reflective about what it is that inspires you, engages you, because as an activist, you're always going to be told that you're weird. You're always going to be told that you're just like being stupid, that you're wasting your time. You literally might have people being mean to you, right? Like you might actually have to sacrifice certain career things depending on how you feel about it. And so really being clear about what is your core and what's going to keep you happy and energized while you do that work. I think I was sort of talking with someone, I can't remember what it was, and also I'm very intentional about my different spheres of my life. So for example, it was very clear to me that my partner, like I didn't want to come home to a household and be like, oh, the shitty thing happened to me today, and then have to explain why that's shitty to someone else, right? Like, so talk about extreme vetting, right? My white wife went through extreme vetting, like to get to where she is, right? But I tolerate that to a certain extent in my colleagues, right? And to varying degrees within my friendships. I have other friends who have been partnered to people who are not as, so I would say, enlightened, but open. And so in their personal relationships, they do spend a lot of energy sort of having these conversations, and they find it rewarding because their partner sort of grows with them. But in my opinion, it means that they need to have friendships that they have where they don't have to do that explaining, right? Because it's really hard to have all areas of your life like that. And being intentional about that. Yeah.
What inspired you to fight the good fight? Or like, was there anything that happened in your life or someone?
Yeah. Good question. I think we all like to think there are dramatic moments, and certainly there are ones that I can think of that I can point to. But apparently, even as a young child, my mom has this memory. I don't have this memory. Apparently, as a kid, I already wanted to be a doctor, which I also don't remember. Talk about internalized like stereotypes. But she said I was only like 6 or something like that, and I told her I wanted to be a doctor and that I wanted to do Doctors Without Borders. What 6-year-old knows about Doctors Without Borders, whatever? And my mom was like, "No, that's like too dangerous." Right? Like, I'm not going to let you do it or whatever. And she said that the next day she was like, she overheard me talking to my sister and it was like, just wait till mommy dies. Then I'm going to go do Doctors Without Borders. Like, I have no recollection of this whatsoever. So maybe just inherent. I would say that my dad is someone who's almost Aspergy when it comes to things that are right and wrong. And so I would say that one of the things that I've internalized from him is both a blessing and a curse, right? Which is that I have very low tolerance for things that I don't think are good. But that also makes me kind of miserable. And sometimes maybe socially unlikable.
Thank you.
Yeah. Use the microphone.
So something I've been thinking about more and more is we always talk about this concept of Asian people having stigma about mental health. And I think that gets a lot more expanded upon Asians in general, whether that be those who immigrated here or those who remained back in their country of origin. And coming from an Indian culture, and I think often an East Asian culture as well, mind-body medicine is something that's been practiced for years, and it's something that's been very effective in the countries of origin. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. I feel that often the populations that did immigrate as Asians to the United States were those who linked with colonial movements towards here. For example, in India, those who were linked, my family is a line of engineers, so they were linked with the railroads. So they made money off of pleasing the white man and being engineers working for the British. And I think they're people who tried to follow values of those white people in those countries. And when they went back, when they left India, the things that they advertised, whether that was in healthcare or however. So I think my relatives who are back in India, sometimes they come from one of two breeds. The ones who still want to immigrate here and follow those medical pathways, saying that, mental illness is awkward and people should be institutionalized. But then I have the other breed who are, my mom's an artist, so she's a lot more into the yoga, Ayurveda, and everything else. Sorry, there's like a million.
Yeah, you should come with a chart.
But I want to speak my mind.
I think what I'm getting. So what I'm hearing you say is, do you think that this idea that Asian Americans have a mental health stigma is because those who came to this country, there was some sort of external pressure that selected for those who have that stigma to come? Right. Oh, right. Whether it's a response or an internalized want to be like white folks, right? I don't know. That sounds like someone's thesis. That also sounds dangerously like, and this is the issue with history, right? Is that we get there, it's even worse than statistics. We get to take whatever happened and then decide how we're going to interpret it and say whatever causes us. Because my first thought when you said it was actually something totally different, which is along the same lines of homophobia, for example. There's this feeling that, for example, being queer is less accepted in populations of color, right? I don't know if that's true. I'm not sure that anyone has done a study, a poll where they call up and you say, you're Asian? How do you think about gay people? What if it was your son? Maybe to a certain extent, but nothing that's statistically you're going to turn to, right? What I do wonder is if homophobia in a country like this, where there's a majority of white folks, is that much more damaging in people of color, because it means that you are now not only you are initially not already part of the majority group, and now you're even being shunned by the minority group that you were part of. And so I do believe that there's probably something more emotionally isolating about it, and I wonder if that's what we pick up on. But to answer that, similarly, I don't know that there's a larger stigma against mental health in Asian Americans than anyone else, right? Yeah, and I think and so again, that's what I'm saying is I'm not even sure if that's true. I wonder if that's just a manifestation of the biases that we have. Use the microphone.
I will use the microphone. I have a question about questioning the researches about race and medicine. How would you implement that when insurance companies won't pay you unless you have an explanation as to why you're prescribing that type of medication? And the easiest way is UpToDate has told me that I should prescribe these medications for these races. And how do you question those research and as well as implementing them onto patients. Do you understand what I mean?
I might be having a little bit of difficulty picturing that, mostly because almost all of the guidelines around race are not things that the insurance companies have anything to do with. Mostly because they're so general, they're so basic. Like, no insurance company cares what your first line hypertensive is unless it's like a really expensive first one. So I think that's what I'm having difficulty conceptualizing, is that I can't come up with a time in which an insurance company would make a decision based on race. Yeah. But I think I think the bigger question that you're sort of getting to is maybe like, how do you play a game that you don't agree with? Is that kind of what you're saying? Like, I mean, I have no problems with like working the system for an individual person, right? Or for myself, if I feel like that is like, if the ends justify the means. What I do is I try to be really explicit when I teach. So, for example, I think about, again, my sphere of influence. So, like, if I'm doing something that I kind of don't feel really great about, but the only 3 people who are witnessing it are me, the patient, and one other, like, insurance company person, like, I don't really care. But if I'm doing it and now it's involving a nurse and a resident who's in training, like, I'm very explicit to them. I'll say, like, I'm doing this. This is the reason why, and these are the reasons why I disagree with it. But we're still doing it because of these reasons, right? Or similarly, when I pick first-line blood pressure medications, if I say like, oh, this person, Black patient, I'm going to pick hydrochlorothiazide for them, I don't let what normally goes unsaid go unsaid. So, for example, if I'm pre-studying resident and that happens, I might say, yeah, I think hydrochlorothiazide is a great pick for them as a first line. I want to be clear that I'm not picking that because of this guideline for ACEs and ARBs. I'm picking it because their diastolic blood pressure is higher, and there's some physiologic argument that a diuretic in that case would be the one. And so just trying to be very explicit about the decision making you make in the areas that you know that interpretation is ripe for racism. I guess that's it.
Yeah, that's it. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.